This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast number 119, Originality. I am Hal Hammonds, and I am a citizen of heaven, and your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. Thanks for checking in this week. I wanted two true originals to be my guests this week, and I think I found them. Mark Roberts preaches for the Westside Church of Christ in Irving, Texas. He is the author of numerous books, including Understanding Apocalyptic Literature and Seeking God's Way. Terry Francis returns to the podcast this week. He preaches for the Chelsea Church of Christ in the Birmingham area and is the co-host of the Do the Work podcast. We discuss the original Son of God, the most remarkable book in human history, and how much originality is too much for gospel preachers. Let's start with what I've been preaching. Romans 8:14 says those who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. But clearly the only begotten Son of John 3:16 is quite different. In the end, those who wear the name of Christ are nothing more than copies of the original, and poor copies at that. For those who may not be Christians, what is it about Jesus that makes him so different? And how can we make ourselves over in his image? Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Well, I guess what comes to mind when I was thinking about this, Mark, I guess I'll kick us off, is even going back to the beginning. I mean, in Genesis 1, we're copies of God to bear his image. And it seems like we do a pretty poor job of living up to that standard mankind does initially, just because man chooses rebellion and he seeks his own path rather than trusting in God. And I think that kind of starts where we get to. And Hal's probably not surprised that I went back to the garden, since that's kind of turned into a thing over the last year and a half with me and Phil on Do the Work. But, you know, I've been studying the concept of mankind being made to be prophet, priest, and kings. And in the garden, we see that priest and king especially motif there. And we really destroy that. And then Jesus comes in according to the order of Melchizedek as a priest and king to show us what to be like. And we still do pretty poor about that. I mean, you know, we think Peter calls us a royal priesthood for a reason. So it just seems to be interesting how far we struggle with that. That was my first thought when I'm kind of prepping for this, is just how that's been man's problem from the beginning. It just seems to be continuously for all of us. In that sense.
Well, I'll jump in with Terry on the garden. I'm teaching Genesis in our adult Bible class on Sunday mornings. We've just talked about Genesis 1 and 2 in creation, and then Genesis 3, the disaster of sin. And one of the things, of course, that really stands out there is the devil challenging the goodness of God. And the more I've thought about that, I've had some opportunities to do some work in some other areas and preached a meeting on the goodness of God, and just have done some other things with that. The more I see some of our fundamental problems are we just don't trust God. We just don't trust that God's way is best. We don't trust that God knows what he's doing. We don't trust that God's going to work it out and that God has got this handled. And so we strike off on our own and we believe the lies of the serpent and we do things our own way. And what you're looking around at today with a very broken world and broken humanity is the results of people, men and women, you and I, who have decided we know better than God. And the reason we think we know better than God is because we have become convinced somehow God is not good. And that's a fundamental truth that's affirmed hundreds of times in Scripture, both in the actions and in explicit statements of Scripture, that God is good. And we just need to trust him more and do things his way, see that he does love us and care for us and want what is best for us. He is trying to restore us back to that garden. In some ways, we're going back there kicking and screaming, it seems, because we just know so much more than the Lord. We just need to trust God's way. We need to trust God that he is good. And that would just go an awful long ways on helping us be what the Lord wants us to be.
Yeah, and we're so quick to kind of just discard all the things that God says. You know, when you think about trusting God, I mean, from the beginning, you know, it's interesting that Eve is right. She correctly repeats what she's been told. Hey, when you eat of this tree, you're going to die. In fact, I think one of the things that's interesting is I've started referring to that tree as the tree of death rather than the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I think it just makes more sense. You've got this tree of life in one part of the garden, you've got this tree of death. And, that's an adequate way to represent it, because God said, when you eat of this tree, you're going to die. And the serpent says, well, that's not true. And she just immediately goes, okay, well, I guess God was wrong, and, and it's just interesting how quickly you just discard what God says. And so, and of course, part of that is, as it says, that it was able to make her wise. And I'm the more I study that, and you're there, Mark, I think God was working in his own time to give wisdom to Adam and Eve. I don't think it was God's intention to just have them there in the garden for this endless eternity. But when she saw a quicker, faster way to get it, in her mind, even though it was a cheaper version, that's what she did. And I think that's what impacts us, by the way, when it comes to being like Jesus and being a copy of the original, is just, we want to take the quicker, more convenient way in our mind to life in general. And you see our problems in our country with that and everything else, that we really are a society that wants immediate gratification rather than having to prolong and work for things. So, I'm told that I'm going to receive the ultimate pleasure in eternity. That's what I'm going to get. But rather than go through this suffering trial period here for a brief amount of time to get to there, I want all the pleasure I could get now. And in a way, we're continually eating of the tree of death in our own lives. We're doing things that God says the end of this is death. I mean, the wages of sin are death. When we don't trust God, what ends up happening is, not only do I not follow that original copy of Jesus, and not only do I not reflect God's glory and the image of his son, who's the fullness of God, not only do I not do that, but I'm also at the same time earning death with my behavior. And God's done his part for grace, but I've got to at some point choose life over death in this whole thing. And God's told me how to choose life. He's told me what that's going to take. But at some point, I've got to start trusting God, like Mark is saying, in the goodness of God, and choose life. And it's ironic that for me to be like Jesus, I need to choose life. And for me to be like Jesus, he had to choose death. I think that's one of the more ironic things there when you think of those two things. Now, obviously, there's a sacrifice of my life now in order to have that eternal life. But that's where it's got to start with me. And I think we fail to see that we're eating of the tree of death almost daily when we take these easy ways out, like Adam and Eve did. So much of, and I used to make fun of Phil initially when he started doing this, Hal, and you know that because you listened to our broadcast. But so much of everything we see is just a continuation of what happened in Genesis 3. We're just repeating that same thing over and over and over again. And it starts with not trusting God and instead trusting somebody who's described as the father of lies. And yet we trust the father of lies instead of trusting the owner of truth. And it's quite disturbing. And yet it sounds judgmental. I make the same mistake. I think all three of us have made the same mistake. We continually struggle with that process in our life.
And I think part of that may be the senses. Eve saw that the tree was good to eat. There was an appeal to the eyes. There was the appeal to the pride of life, the appeal to the flesh, as John will talk about it later. But we are physical, material creatures, and so instead of by faith trusting in the goodness of God, we trust in what we can see and know. And so I can't help but think about that, and I love what you said about how our society just keeps repeating this mistake. And it made me think about, when you talked about the tree of death, made me think about what Jesus offers. Jesus says he is the bread of life, but our society is feeding the bread of death. And everywhere you look, you see so much death, and it's because people are stuffing their mouths full of the bread of death. But the bread of death looks good. It smells good. And so rather than trusting in the Lord, that his bread is better, our society is eating the bread of death everywhere, all of the time. I think about maybe in sexual temptation with young people. So society says, gratify your flesh, do what you want to do in whatever way you want to do it with, and whoever you want to do it with. And the Lord says this relationship is special and sacred and will be best with one person in a covenant relationship for all of life known as marriage. And it's just a trust question. Is God right about that? Or is it better for me to be involved sexually with anybody and everybody, all that I can as fast as I can? And one way is the way of death, and one way is the way of life. But many, unfortunately, don't trust that God, like I said, knows what he's doing and that God wants what's best for us. Somehow, the devil's done an outstanding job of painting God, just as he did in Genesis 3, as holding out. And instead of God being the good guy, God is the bad guy, and the devil is the good guy who's liberating us to these wonderful new things. What the devil is doing is he's marketing the bread of death well.
Yeah, and I heard somebody read a book, and I can't remember who it was. So I can't remember. I think it was Ortberg or Farrar, possibly, that talked about how in the garden, in the garden in Genesis 3, that what Satan does is he changes the price tags. That God says, here's the cost. Here's what's going to happen if you eat of this tree. And the devil comes in and he swaps the price tag, and he's like, no, that's not what's going to happen. You're not going to die. You're going to get smart. This isn't going to cost you. You're going to get a refund on your investment.
It's going to benefit you. This will be good for you.
Yeah. This isn't a penalty. God's saying there's a consequence, and the Satan says, no. This is like winning the lottery. This is like getting something. This isn't going to cost you anything. And
Terry, if you're going to,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I should have interrupted. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that continually happens in our life. We continually do things we've been told, here's the consequence, here's the cost. But Satan's able to deceive us and convince us that there's actually a reward that's greater than the cost. And it's a lie. It's all a lie in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Terry, if you're going to talk about the garden very long at all, I'm going to ask you, how much emphasis have you put upon Adam's role there? Because I think if we're going to talk societal, something like that, one of our big issues today, and that I'm very concerned about, I've had opportunity to think about and talk about and work with some young people, especially with, is the lack of real manhood today. And I think the ESV translation in Genesis 3 is really good, that she took and gave to Adam with her. And of course, the sharpest condemnation from God comes to Adam when he says, because you have hearkened to the voice of your wife. Adam should have stood in front of her. Adam should have been her leader and protector. Adam should have said, we don't talk to snakes. Hand me that rock and I will take care of this problem for you. And he should have, Paul says that Eve was deceived, but Adam was not. So Adam failed in his role of leadership there. He failed to trust that God is good. He failed to protect the image of God within them, and the result was disastrous. And we're really struggling as a society today with what manhood is and what manliness is. There's real difficulties with that. And so the bread of death is being served up, and men are not stepping forward to protect their wives and to protect their children, to protect their families, and say, we're not eating that. That's no good. That's no good at all. We trust the Lord. He is good.
Yeah. Years ago in a series on the home, I had a 2-sermon series, and it was funny at the time because Adam Shanks was my coworker. So the first lesson was called Don't Be an Adam, and the second lesson was called Be Like Jesus. And it was directed at husbands and fathers. And in the Don't Be the Adam, the point was there that in the garden, obviously, Adam to some degree had done part of his role, because Eve knew what the law was concerning the tree of death. And in Genesis 2, that law is told to Adam. And Adam's role is a prophet, priest, and king to his family. And again, that motif is seen. Think about Job. He acts as a priest for his family, going to make sacrifice for his children. That's just seen throughout Scripture. And so you see Adam does that role a little bit. He tells her what it is because she knows what it is. We don't see anywhere else where that's mentioned. And so I'm just going to assume that Adam is the one that shared that. Hey, here's the one tree you can't work with. But like you said in the ESV, it seems pretty clear. Eve's not alone. Adam's with her in this scene with the serpent. He's standing right there. And in Genesis 3, you have the first instance of if mama's not happy, nobody's happy. I think that's what you see there, is that dad's going to make the wife happy. And there's a lot of reasons why that happens for men. But Eve is blamed for the first sin, but Adam bears accountability in that process because he didn't act like the husband he should have acted. He didn't stand up and tell Eve, no, we're not going to eat of this. And when Eve brought it to him, he didn't say, no, I'm not going to eat of this. Adam suddenly, they took a rib out of his side and gave it to Eve, and somehow he lost his backbone in Genesis 3. And it just becomes kind of spineless there. But by the way, I don't think that's a problem just in Genesis 3 today. I mean, you read the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible is filled with stories of flawed male leadership. I mean, we praise David. He's a terrible father. I mean, he just seems to have miserable kids. And I know part of that is a consequence from what happens with David and Bathsheba. That's part of what Nathan says a little bit, is there's going to be trouble from inside your household. But not just David. Samuel's sons, they were a mess. You look at Saul, who was a king, but didn't want to be a king, doesn't seem to stand up hardly anything except when it's wrong. I mean, there's just story after story after story outside of the prophets, who seem to be pretty great guys, and Joshua, who may be the greatest male hero of the Hebrew Bible, by the way, and oddly enough is not mentioned in Hebrews 11. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but outside of that, most of those guys, they're flawed. They're deeply flawed. They fail just like Adam did. And I mean, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, those characters are filled with stories of failure when you really look at them. Now, God molds them and shapes them and brings them and all that. And we see that. And we see God's ability with David. And David's the best king, by the way. I mean, look, but we see God's ability to use those men and to mold them and shape them. And that's great. But like us, they walked in the ways of Adam in Genesis chapter 3. And I mean, the reality is, I think a lot of men are doing that. It is our job to protect our homes. It is our job to not eat the bread of death, the tree of death. And yet, because a lot of times we just don't want to deal with the consequences, and we think that it'll be okay, we just go along with it like Adam did.
Well, I think
Go ahead.
I think Jacob is probably the best example of what you're talking about there. He's the father of the nation, after all. He's the one who gets everything started, and we follow in Jacob's footsteps as the people of God. Some of us turn out good, some of us don't turn out good, and that's what brings Jesus to the forefront here, the one who says that the devil has found nothing in me. That's why he is able to stand up for good. That's why he's able to consistently make good choices, because there's no root of bitterness inside of him. There's no tendency toward the wrong things. He knows the good. He's completely committed to doing the good. And we may have our good days, we may have our good generations, but we'll never completely lick that problem. And that's why it's so important that we work hard to maximize our opportunities, to do the best we can under the circumstances, that we learn from our mistakes, learn from our parents' mistakes, learn from our brothers' mistakes, and get to a point where we can, with some degree of consistency, show ourselves to be children of God after a sort of fashion, at least, in the way that Jesus was, where we are committed on a daily basis to fulfilling his will, that the priorities that we would naturally pursue, the things that Adam and Eve pursued, the things that all of us pursue at a certain level, to a certain degree, that we can minimize that. We can push that to the background. We can say, I need to overcome that. And by the grace of God, we're given opportunity, we're given mercy, we're given forgiveness, and we can grow from this to be children of God, to be led by the Spirit, to be more about what God wants us to be.
Yeah, I was thinking when you were talking about Jesus, one of the things that comes to mind with Jesus and why he was so successful is Jesus didn't take any shortcuts. Like, he didn't take the easy way out of anything when you think about it.
Part of that temptation when the devil tempts Jesus in Luke 4, Matthew 4, is, hey, you can be a king without the cross.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Jesus.
And there's people that doubt that, Mark, that's possible, but that would have been possible. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing.
Well, and the bread made from stones. Yeah. Jesus is the first person in human history who does not have to wait on his heavenly Father. He can provide food on his own. He can live on his own. He doesn't need his Father's help. And he chooses to submit himself to the Father in that
Right.
situation. I would rather live under my Father's auspices than make some kind of kingdom on my own. And going back to what you guys were saying earlier, making our own kingdom, making ourselves king in that kingdom. That's what our life on earth is all about. And that we're sorely tempted in that direction. And most of us fail.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's interesting is in Genesis 3, I mean, there's a lot that goes into this, but the tend the garden and keep it, that ties to the same languages used for the priesthood and the tabernacle and the temple, and the idea of being kings to show the glory of God to the nations around. I mean, that's repeated over and over again. And Adam and Eve are being groomed to fill those roles of priest and king to the world. And they choose instead to take the easy way out and establish their own kingdom rather than be a priest and king. And we do the same thing. We're, part of what this is too, pride creeps into this. We want to establish our own kingdom. We want to be known as our own man. We want to control our own things rather than through the patience and God working in us to mold us and shape us like he did. And I think that's one of the things you see with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Joseph and some of those stories is that if you will hang on in faith and you will trust God, God will help you become who you're supposed to be despite all your flaws. And if we will continually do that, we will be prophet, priest, and kings in Christ's kingdom. The problem is we don't want to go through that process of molding and shaping and the time it takes and all that. We want it right now. We want our own wisdom. We want to be like God, to go back to Genesis 3 and tie back to that idea. We want the immediate reward. We don't want to hold off. All those things tie into that. And that's ultimately why we don't do well as these copies of Jesus. And that's because truthfully, we're raised not to be a copy of anybody else. And I think that's one of the things that ties into this as well. In our American culture, we've got that John Wayne mentality where we don't need anybody else. And especially now, I do think that is one thing that I've seen more and more and more and more today is this idea of not being like everybody else. We want to stick out. We want to be different. And that's become such a thing for everybody else that now it's almost like you're going to stick out if you do conform to Christ, which is true. But and it's not even conforming to the world, except for this idea of be your own man. Dress weird, act weird, be weird. That seems to be the mantra of our day in some ways. And this rejection of uniformity, rejection of authority, all that, I think, plays into this kind of issue that's at play. And I do think that is getting worse in a lot of ways today. But that's a whole nother discussion, I guess.
Terry keeps talking about kings and kingdom. In a minute, I'm going to have to talk about Narnia and C.S. Lewis. That's all I can say about that.
This is what I've been reading. At first, I had planned on asking my guests which book of the Bible they considered to be the most original, but the Bible itself is the biggest original of all. From the history of its compilation to its consistent theme of faith and redemption to the chief character himself, the Bible reads like no other book in human history. And therein lies both the greatest attraction and the greatest challenge. How can the same book be an object of adoration to some and an object of scorn to others?
Terry, you want to go first?
I went first last time. I'm letting you go.
Well, I think this is a hard issue. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 1 that the gospel, which is the power of God to save, is just foolishness to some people and a stumbling block to others. Whether we see the Bible as the single greatest work ever and as the key and the map and pathway to the Lord, to understand his goodness and what he has for us, or whether we decide that it's some sort of hoax and just a pile of ancient folklore and myths, is in many ways going to be determined by our heart. We're reading the Gospel of John in our daily Bible reading now, and we're just going to see that theme again and again and again, that the very same event can have very different results depending upon the heart of the people who are looking at that and who are seeing what Jesus says and what Jesus does. In John 9, Jesus heals the man born blind, and there's no question. Nobody ever says, we think he faked it. That was done with smoke and mirrors.
Right.
No, there's no discussion of that at all. There's just an absolute, resolute determination on the part of the Pharisees to not accept the implications and meaning of that miracle, while the man who has no religious training, gradually, it's a beautiful progression in John 9, he gradually grows to greater and greater faith as he begins to grasp what's happened to him and what this most certainly means. And that's just repeated. John 5, Jesus heals the man on the Sabbath, and that just causes a complete freak out on the part of the religious leadership. And everybody's seeing the same thing. And some people are saying, hey, that's the Messiah. And some people are seeing that and saying, no, we should kill that guy. And of course, that comes to a head in John 11 when Jesus does a mega miracle and raises Lazarus from the dead. This is a no holds barred, absolutely no doubt, completely authentic resurrection of the dead. There's a big crowd there. It's right on top of Jerusalem. There's no denying any of this. And some people go home and say, this is it. This is the Messiah. And the religious leadership of the day, they rally up and say, okay, this is a real problem. We have got to get this guy killed. And so the very same event has very different reactions to it based on the heart of the people seeing what's going on there, which means, of course, I need to be asking myself, what is in my heart? And what preconceptions, what prejudices, what have I already decided? The Pharisees had made some decisions about Jesus. They'd made some decisions about what the Messiah should do and be and look like. Jesus didn't fit that. And so he's out. He's out. It doesn't matter he raised somebody from the dead. He's out. He can't be it. So I need to be constantly searching my heart to see what is there that is going to obstruct me from seeing Jesus and responding to Jesus as I really should. This is really a hard issue.
Yeah, I agree. I also think it's a little bit of a knowledge issue, because I think what happens as you progress, if your heart's just already prone to reject the idea of God and the idea of the Bible being God's word, and you've already determined that it's foolishness, then you're not going to actually try to dive in and read the Bible and see it for what it is. And I think one of the things that impresses me more and more and more, and as I continue to study, is just, we talk about, we joked around earlier about Tolkien and Lewis and authors like that, but those are great, respected literary works. But just from the standpoint of when you talk about the Bible being an original book, and if you just look how all of that fits together so perfectly, and the idea that there's 66 different books within this collection, and 40 different authors, and all of those things in a period of time. And and this isn't, by the way, I think what's interesting is this isn't questioned. The manuscript evidence to prove the diversity of this work is out there. And so when you think about that and you start reading and you just start seeing things like we talked in the first segment about how the garden impacts every other kind of part of the book, and how all of these things connect and how they work together. Not only are the miracles in the Bible so faith enriching, but to me, just the Bible itself and the way that it reads. And it's interesting how people can talk about textual criticism, and they go in looking for problems because they don't accept the Bible, and they can find a few conflicts. But if you were to approach textual criticism from the approach of trying to see the Bible as it is, the Word of God, what you see is an overwhelming amount of connections over and over and over again, which is why the Bible is such an impressive work from that standpoint. And I think that's what always stands out to me personally, is when you actually take the time to study the scriptures and for instance, just look at it as if you wanted to begin with, as a story, and just see how it connects and goes together so well. It's overwhelming to see how well all of that works. And so I think it's a heart problem that then leads to, rather than trying to study this and see this for what it is, when you've already determined that this is foolishness, you're just trying to study and see it as foolishness. And we all carry the baggage of our worldview into everything. That's just a reality of life. And so if that's what we've determined it to be, that's what we'll look for. But if you could somehow empty yourself of that baggage and back out, then you could you could see it for what it is. It is an amazing work. Um, and when you finally see that, I think what I'm more convinced of than ever before, when you finally see all the connectivity in Scripture and how all of it goes together just overwhelmingly, you realize that could only be done with 40 authors if there was what we call inspiration. If there was something directing the storyline above the authorship of those individual books, to think of it that way. And so I think what's interesting is the heart causes people not to want to see that. That's what ends up happening when we think about the originality of the book and how impressive it is. So it causes people not to want to see that because their heart's already predetermined that this is foolishness. And, again, prepping for this, I thought of the same passage Mark did, that, to us, we see this as the power of salvation, but the world sees this as just pure foolishness.
Well, and as we stop seeing it as the power of God to salvation, as we start seeing it as philosophy or one way of looking at things or whatever, we wind up essentially the rationalist point of view winds up looking a lot more like the atheist point of view than the believer point of view. Essentially, the very first proverb given to us in Proverbs 1 verse 7 is the fear of God is the beginning of knowledge. And when we pursue God, we pursue a study of the Bible with the idea of the fear of God. We are looking at this as a pathway to finding God's way, to finding God's path for our life. Then we got a shot at this. We may be able to put this into our life, to graft it into our heart and transform our lives. If we persist in seeing the Bible as yet another book, yet another attempt to make sense out of life, we continue to try to shove God's round peg into mankind's square hole. The Sermon on the Mount is probably the best example of this. How could you possibly preach a gospel of turn the other cheek? That doesn't work. We all know that doesn't work. Why would you go the extra mile for somebody who's not going a mile with you? That is nonsensical. That's because you're looking at the Bible the same way you're looking at any other book. That this is some way to enhance your life, some way to get the most out of your life. And so many so-called gospel preachers are doing exactly that with the Bible. And their hypocrisy shows because they just can't do a very good job with that. That's not what the Bible is intended to do. It's intended to draw you closer to God. It may serve some carnal purposes. It will serve some carnal purposes from time to time, but that's not the purpose of the book. It's looking at the Bible the way you'd look at any other book in the self-help aisle or even any other book in the religion aisle is flawed at its concept. If you don't approach it with the fear of God in the first place, or at least with the attitude that you want to find the fear of God, you're going to miss the boat entirely.
And think about how that connects to what we talked about earlier in the garden. I mean, Genesis 3 is what? You could have the knowledge of good and evil if you wait on the fear of God and learn from God. No, I want that now. I want that right now. I don't want to go through the process of the fear of waiting on God and letting God direct that. I want to direct getting that knowledge. And so that's exactly what's put us in this situation and ever since then, we've determined that we have knowledge, that God doesn't have knowledge, but we have knowledge, which is what leads to this heart problem Mark's talking about.
I do think that Terry's put his finger on an important area for Christians to be more thoughtful about today. And that is that people approach the Bible differently today than maybe they did 100 years ago or 50 years ago. In our culture, I think if you jumped into a time machine, you load up the TARDIS and you head back 100 years ago, even if people are not living according to the Word of God, people would have said the Bible is God's Word. The Bible is an inspired book. The Bible, comes from God. I'm not reading it. I'm not doing what it should. But yeah. There was the precondition there would be that I accept that as a sacred and holy book. And now, of course, that has dramatically changed where people don't feel that way about the Bible at all. So people are coming to the Bible with a very different set presuppositions, which means we're going to have to do some things very differently. 100 years ago, you could sit down with your neighbor and say, hey, let's read this book and find Christianity and find God. And maybe they're having troubles in their life. And so we could, sit down and talk about God's plan for marriage and those kinds of things. And we were at the same starting point that, this is God's word. Now we are not at the same starting point with people at all. We're going to need to back the starting line up 10 feet, maybe 100 feet, and do the work necessary to lay down that this is God's word, just so it can get a fair hearing. And as Terry was talking about all that, what a masterpiece of literature it is, I couldn't help but think about, we have some stuff in our society today that's working like that. The Star Wars films, and there's a lot of discussion. I know some huge Star Wars fans, and some of them are really unhappy about the direction some of that's gone and so forth. Or the Avenger films, and it's 20-something movies, and they all came together. And I don't think anybody at the beginning of that, saw how that arc was going to go and how all that was going to work together and come full circle and all those kind of things. And we admire that. We admire the Tolkien stories. We admire the Lewis stories. Maybe it's time for Christians to talk with people who don't accept the Bible as the Word of God and just begin to say some things about, this is a great piece of literature, and let's read it at that level and see if you don't see some things here that maybe more is going on here than you thought. There are plenty of folks, there's a number of books that have been written in the apologetics field by people who are unbelievers who decided they were going to read the Bible to prove it's wrong. They're going to get in there, they're going to find all those contradictions. They'll show everybody how wrong the Bible is, and they come out the other side of that, and they've become believers in the Bible. The Bible is enormously powerful. It is sharper than any two-edged sword. If we could just get people to interact with the Bible at some level and maybe do a little heart preparation there, if we get those two things working, some really good things can happen. If we can, if we just turn the Word of God loose on people, some very cool things can happen. So if you thought the Avengers movies were really impressive, that they could tie all that together, hey, watch this. This is, 1,500, 2,000 years and 40 different writers, and there's a garden at the beginning, and guess what's the last thing on the last page of the Bible? Yeah.
And it's interesting. So in the quarantine period, one of the things my family did is we watched all the Avenger movies in what would have been the right order, right? And not necessarily when they were made, but the Marvel timeline. And it would be interesting because my son's really into all that. He would pause at some points and go, hey, and not main characters. We're talking about, like, at one time they're in that aircraft carrier that's in the sky thing, and he paused and there's somebody sitting in the console, and he's like, that person becomes this person later on. And he's like, I never noticed that. And it's like, this person's basically an extra who then's developed into a main character. And the first time you see that, when they're just sitting at this console in the middle of this air carrier thing, you would never have thought, hey, that's going to be Agent so-and-so. But that's how it works. And so we sit there with these movies and we're like amazed at that. But then look at the Bible and you see there's a garden, and you read the tabernacle and then the temple plans, and you see all this garden imagery in the temple, and you see a cherubim at the end of Genesis 3 keeping you from the presence of God. And in the tabernacle and temple, what's guarding you from the most holy place? There's cherubim there at the entrance to the most holy place. There's all of these connections. Yeah, stitched on the curtains and on the over the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant. There's all of this imagery that is completely tied in and connected over and over and over and over again, right? And we'll pause a Marvel movie and go, wow, isn't that cool? We'll read right past the description of the tabernacle and temple and never make the connection to Genesis 3. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing how much effort we put into Star Wars and into Marvel and all these other things that have absolutely no meaning on your life. I mean, they're just entertainment at the end of the day. And yet here's something that's life-changing, and we don't take the time to see all these connections. We don't take the time to see these things. Our thematic, I'm like Mark, I changed this because of Mark. I'm a planner when it comes to my sermons, and I think he does quarterly. Now I do annually, but one of the things we plan is a series, and this year half of our lessons are about how all of these stories, the Tower of Babel and David and the flood, and all these stories point to Jesus and show us this, and there's different ways that it points to Jesus. But, earlier Mark was talking about how Jesus came and he was unexpected. I mean, the lesson yesterday is how David is chosen as king. He's the least expected of his family. Nobody thinks that David should be the king. He's so unexpected that they don't even bring him in for Samuel to look at him. They have to call him in from the fields because it can't be this guy, right? And it's not because he's a boy and some of that stuff we've misconstrued, but still, he's not the expected king. Hey, guess what Isaiah 53 says? That's Jesus. Jesus comes on the scene. He doesn't look like a king. He doesn't act like a king. He doesn't hang out with the people a king should hang out with. He doesn't enter into Jerusalem like a king. He's on the back of a donkey. You think about all of these different things, and you see how David, this unexpected king, points to our unexpected king. You see all this connectivity, like I said, and we see it in a Marvel movie. We see it, in those movies, but here we just kind of overlook that. And I think that's one of the more powerful things. I mean, yes, fulfilled prophecy is powerful. We've all heard, the 300 plus prophecies of Jesus. And if you just took 8 of them, it's, this astronomical number to tie in Texas for Mark. It's like putting $1 silver dollar marked and, 2 feet deep across the state of Texas, and you reach down and you find them. We've all seen that probability and all that stuff. And that is overwhelming. And that's good. But I got to tell you what also is overwhelming. The way this book is put together and the way it connects over these thousands of years and these different authors, that's overwhelming. That's impressive. And that's hard to overlook.
Well, it's a New Testament perspective. Reading the Old Testament from Isaiah's perspective or Moses' perspective or Enoch's perspective is fine as far as that goes. And it's impressive knowing that you're communicating with God. But like with the Avengers or any other completed series or more completed than one single episode anyway, looking back in hindsight, we're able to see the whole thing laid out in front of us. And especially the Jesus story. So much of it was not only unknown to these people in the past, but it was unknowable to them. God had no intention of letting Isaiah understand the fullness of his plan, or Moses or anybody else. And we do. We have it laid out for us. We never would have thought that Hosea 11:1 was talking about Jesus. Out of Egypt I called my son. And then Matthew says it is. Okay, well, I suppose so. And then he goes on, especially Matthew, to show one example after another. We were always talking about Jesus. This was always the plan, tying the whole thing together. As much interaction as you may have with various movie franchises or book series or whatever, you're never going to find a volume of work that connects to a single theme so completely, so thoroughly as the Bible does. It's just, the more you look at it from our perspective, the more we take a New Testament perspective into the Old Testament, the more we realize the wisdom and the power of God and the sufficiency of the Bible. And again, how different this is than anything else we've ever run across.
Well, the mystery has been revealed, right?
Right.
I mean, that's what we're talking about. And it's like in that Marvel character, right? We've seen that later movie because they don't come out in the timeline. We know that actor becomes a different, or the same character, but it develops into this character. So we take that into the previous film when we rewatch it and we go, oh, well, that's who that is. The mystery's been revealed in that sense.
Right.
Same's true here. We live with the fulfillment of the prophecies and of the scriptures. We live in a time where the mystery's been revealed. So we can look back and we can see all of these things. We can see how all this works. But this is also, by the way, and this is also why you never stop studying and you never stop reading the Bible, is because, this understanding that I have about the garden and the temple and tabernacle, guys, that's just a few years old for me. That's something I've stumbled on the last 3 to 5 years. That's not something that I knew 15 years ago. And I hope that 5 years from now, I've learned even more about the way the scriptures and the depth and how those things go together. And I think that's one of the things to just keep in mind about all of that is this book is so powerful because, again, you with Marvel and with Lewis and with all those things, when you reread, when you rewatch, you pick up a little bit more, but nothing like this.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing like what the Bible gives you as far as learning and understanding that you gain as you continue to read.
In Luke 24, Jesus walked with the disciples on the road to Emmaus. He explains how everything in Moses and the prophets points to him.
Yeah.
I've often said that's the Bible class that I want to attend.
That would have been
What we need
great.
to do a better job of is helping people see how the Old Testament points to Jesus, that it's one book. The Bible is not 66 different random books that somehow ended up under the same black leather cover, that there is connectivity there and that there's a theme, there's a beginning, there's a middle and an end, and that it's all going together to show Jesus as the way and as the one who has come to bring us back to the garden and to fix the problem that begins in Genesis chapter 3. But a lot of people aren't seeing that. I would just offer this. I do think sometimes we're really obstructed from seeing some of that because we get really lost in some questions that the Bible isn't trying to answer.
Right.
So as I'm teaching Genesis right now, here we get into Genesis chapter 4, and of course the question comes, where did Cain get his wife? And I have that question too, and I understand, curiosity and so forth, but you can't stop the movie and ask, why does that character over there have a brown belt on? The movie isn't answering that question. It's not dealing with that. It's not working with that. And of course, one of the great things about visual medium is if you even have that fleeting thought, as the movie advances, you have to keep going. You have to keep watching. And so your attention is drawn back into the main plot line. When you're reading something, you can press pause and parse down on something. And, what about this? What about this? And so we end up losing the track of the film, so to speak, because we're asking questions the Bible isn't answering every question about everything. It's developing a specific storyline. And again, I understand the curiosity. I get it. But you can chew a Bible class up in a hurry with a lot of speculation about things that the Bible is not concerned with at all and miss what the Bible is concerned with. We just need to do a little better job with that sometimes.
Yeah, Psalm 131 has become one of my favorites, really largely because of the first two verses. It's just 3 verses long, but there David wrote, "O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I've calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me." I mean, I think sometimes part of our problem is that we want to ask questions we can't even begin to grasp. And the book of Job is one of my favorite books. And what does God really do with Job there? At the end, Job basically learns, hey, there's stuff that's just above your pay grade, buddy. There's things you can't begin to understand. And what we have to ultimately do is trust God like that weaned child trust his mother. That's the message of Psalm 131. You just got to put your trust in the Lord. And that's what verse 3 says. "O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore." Put your trust in the Lord. And Job makes a statement that I love in Job 13:15. "Though he slay me, I will put my hope in him." Like there's this underlying kind of reasoning that we got to come at some point to this just acceptance. There's some things I'm not designed to understand. There's some things I will never understand fully. But what God's given us is what we need to know in order to understand the redemption of man. The starting with the garden, the fall from the garden, and then ultimately bringing us back into that garden environment where we walk with God just like Adam and Eve did. Mm-hmm. And that storyline is what he focuses on. And guys, I got to tell you, like when it comes to the afterlife, I got a lot of questions. And I think sometimes we think we know all the answers. And one of the things I've kind of determined here in recent years, because I used to think I knew all the answers. You know what? I don't know what the afterlife's going to be like exactly. There's a lot of things and questions I have. I know this. I know it's going to be better than this. I know my body is going to be different and it's going to be glorious and immortal and perfect. And I know that ultimately I'm going to reside with God for eternity if I will trust this storyline he's given me, and I will put my hope in him, and I will submit to God's plan. And if I will do all of that, here's the thing. I don't know what that's going to look like, but I will. Yeah. I will when my faith becomes sight. And it's okay for my faith to be simply that heaven's better than this. And I don't have to know all the details of what heaven's going to be like. And I think that's one of the things we struggle with.
What Terry's saying right there is he believes God is good, and that ultimately, even without understanding everything about why God said don't eat of this tree, or why God said do this, or why God, Terry believes that God is good, and that this will turn out good if he will trust in the Lord. Right. The book of Job's a great illustration of that. Job has decided he doesn't understand everything that's happening, But the conclusion of that, in the middle of the book, Job has decided God is not good, which is really what the book of Job is about. And then he realizes God is good, and I'm just going to have to stand with God. And I don't know how all this is working. And what's significant about the book of Job is God doesn't explain it to Job.
Yeah.
Job may be one of the greatest illustrations of the inspiration of the Bible, because if a human wrote the book of Job, God would sit Job down at the end and say, hey, watch this tape. Let me show you. See, the devil came in and he was doing this and this and this. And I said, oh, no. And man,
Yeah.
Job, you did pretty good. And I just knew you could do it. And so this is why it all went that. God doesn't do any of that. God doesn't do any of that. God just says, you got to trust me. You got to trust me. I'm good. And that's where Job is at the end of that. And that's where you and I need to be today.
Yeah.
And
Job 1 and 2 is the prequel to the story that Job never gets to see.
Right.
You and I get to see that.
That's
in Job
exactly
1 and
right.
2.
It's an
Job
all-knowing-
never gets any of that information. God never says any of that to him.
Not any of it. He does not ever feel obligated to explain himself to Job. We need to think a lot more about that.
I've always thought it would be interesting if Job were we don't know, of course, but if Job were the first one to actually write this story down, and by inspiration, he's being guided through all this, he's writing chapters 1 and 2. Oh,
Yeah.
that's how it worked out. Now
Yeah.
I understand. Of course, we don't know that.
Yeah.
But to cap what you guys were saying about God being good, the absence of God is bad. The absence of God is, and I think this is one of the reasons why when you see people who knew better and turned themselves on God, Second Peter chapter 2, for example, when you see people who knew the light and chose not to live in the light, their eternal domain is described in terms of darkness rather than fire, almost universally. All the passages that talk about living in darkness for all of eternity, they're all talking about people who knew what fellowship with God was and they rejected it, because that is the ultimate terror. For the average person, being on fire is about as bad as it can get. But for the one who has lived in the presence of God, to suddenly be completely void of God, completely separated from God, that's as bad as it could possibly get. And it should strike terror in us and drive us toward finding that balance. We've been talking about building faith, and we've been talking about building knowledge, and finding that balance between those things, learning all that we possibly can know about what God's plan is for us, and accepting the rest of it by faith, accepting if it doesn't seem like it makes sense, or if it seems like God left a couple of steps out or whatever. God has this. I'm okay with that. I don't need to know everything. I just need to know all that I can know about these things.
I'll cite Lewis again. Sometimes people get very upset about the wages of sin being death. Why is God so hard on sin? Lewis points out very well that since God is the source of life, if you disconnect yourself from God, of course you die. That's not God just made that up and being arbitrary and mean and so forth. If you unplug the light from the socket, the light goes out. That's just how it works. You're going to be in darkness.
And look at the garden. I mean, again, you're in the garden, you have everything provided for you. You have this tree of life, right? You choose the death instead. You're separated from God, you're separated from garden, and you're separated from life. And what happens from Genesis 4 on is, the world becomes a dark place. I mean,
darker and darker.
Yeah, yeah. In Genesis 3, up to that point, really, the world is full of light and life, while man is tending the garden and keeping it, it's not the same kind of work we think of today, obviously, from Genesis 3. So up to Genesis 3, everything is light. But then Genesis 3 forward, life gets darker and darker and darker and darker. And it's interesting that we look at Judges and we study Judges and we see those judges spiraling out of control and how each judge gets worse and worse and worse and worse through the story. But that's really the story of the Hebrew Bible. It's just worse and worse and worse. I mean, think about the United Kingdom to the divided kingdom from the time that God chooses his king, David. If we just kind of remove Saul, where it's kind of like God says, okay, here's what you want. Now here's what you need. But still darker and darker and darker and darker and darker. It's just, that's how man does things, is he pursues darkness when he leaves God. That's what happens.
This is what I've been playing. Just One puts an interesting twist on the social deduction genre. In this game, everyone but one person has the secret word, and they each supply a single word to help the lone soul in darkness find the answer. The twist is any answer supplied by more than one player must be discarded. So you want the answers to be clear enough to get the job done, but not so on the nose as to be duplicated by someone else. As a result, players trying to be original wind up just being confusing. It makes me think of preachers. We don't want our work to be just like everyone else's, or really like anyone else's. We want to be original, but that is not the objective. Truth is the objective. So for the sake of preachers everywhere, especially this one, how can we be different, but not too different? And I'm giving the question to very original preachers.
I'm still trying to sort out the rules to the game that you just read.
I knew that was coming.
After listening to that, I kind of think I either need another cup of coffee or a nap. I'm not sure about, and I'm a big game player. I don't know about that. I've thought about this question. You sent the questions ahead of time, and I've thought about it some. I talked with Dina some about that. It seems to me that there's always going to be some originality in every preacher. Dee says, and I think he's correct, that preaching is the gospel through personality, and that all of us have a unique personality. You see that in the writing of Scripture. Luke is not Paul, and Paul is not John, and John is not Peter. And the Holy Spirit uses those different personalities to bring their own unique vantage point and their own unique way of expressing and teaching and talking about the truths of Scripture. That's going to happen today. Every man in the pulpit is different, and every pulpit is different, and how you are and what you're doing, what's going to be effective and convey the truth of the gospel, maybe in a small town in far west Texas, is not going to be the same as what would work in a big city in New York, and with a very different kind of audience. That's just going to happen. I think the problem begins when we try to make it happen, and because then we're drawing attention away from the message to the messenger, and that is fatal. That is fatal. And I think we've seen in the religious world, and probably we can think of examples even among brethren, of preachers who have made it about themselves and who have found quirks or interesting habits or way of expressing themselves, and that becomes more and more out front. It becomes more and more about them. And so now we're moving into the area of entertainment. We're moving into the cult of personality. We're moving into preacheritis. Anything that we do that detracts from the message is a problem. I try to think of myself as a conduit, as just a big piece of pipe, connecting people to the Scriptures, and ultimately through the Scriptures then to God. And nobody's really that interested in whether the pipe is gray or black or red or purple. People want what the pipe brings. It's not about the pipe. My good friend Jason Harden has a wonderful, wonderful quote that I ended up printing out and that I put on my desk in big letters every Sunday. The Lord's Day is about what the Lord has done. It's not about you. And I think every preacher needs to be reminded of that.
Yeah, when you make the goal of your preaching to be original, you've missed the point. I think that's the thing is, look, my dad was not a preacher, but he was a Bible class teacher, and he loved especially the Old Testament. And my dad died when I was 16, so this would have been early in my life. But my dad used to say a lot, there is nothing new under the sun. And look, that's just you've got to understand that's just a reality. So when it comes to the message of the Bible, if you think you found something neat, cool, and new, you're wrong. Somebody else has already found that at this point. And when you're trying to go out there and find something neat, cool, or new, you're gonna do a couple of things. You're gonna either abuse the text and misuse it, or you're just gonna teach false doctrine in the end if you're not careful. And those are dangerous things. Now, at the same time, what we're really talking about here in being original, when you talk about your preaching being original, it really has to do with your personality and your style is what makes you original, I think. I mean, I'll just look, I love Mark Roberts. There's some things he talked about quirks. Mark Roberts has some quirks, right? One of Mark Roberts' well-known quirks is when he mentions a Bible passage, he's going to say it 3 times. He's going to say everything 3 times. My Bible's open to Matthew 7:1, Matthew 7:1, Matthew 7:1. I mean, he's going to say it 3 times. And there's nothing wrong with that. And by the way, if you do that, you're not imitating Mark Roberts. I'm just saying that's one of the things when you hear Mark preach, you're going to know that's what's going to happen. I don't do that. Right? And while that doesn't, you may think, well, how does that make you original? It does. We are different in a lot of ways. The way we do things and the way we preach the same message is what makes us original. And when you do that, what Mark and I both worked with young preachers, and one of the things I try to get them to do, and I tell them when I talk to them about working with me, is I don't want to turn you into Terry Francis. No, we don't need 2 of those guys. I want you to find who you are. I want you to find your voice. I want you to be who you want to be. And that was different. I've worked with 5 guys. That was different for all 5 of them. None of them were the same. You know, you have one guy that spent his whole life as a musician, was on stage, and he was really reserved, and he needed to loosen up a little bit. Now, not to make it a joke or entertainment, but it wasn't who he was. You have another guy that comes out there, and he was the oldest 19-year-old I've ever worked with in my life. But that's his personality, and he didn't loosen up. He just needed to be who he was, and that was fine. And that's what a lot of times when I think about our originality, what makes us different is just allowing ourselves to be who we are. For a long time when my son lived at home, there was almost not a sermon that went by that Peyton didn't get picked on. In fact, one week went when he didn't get picked on, and all the high school kids sat down front, and they all started looking at him like, what happened? Is your dad mad at you? Kind of thing, you know. That was just part of my style at that time. Now that's evolved and changed. He's older. He doesn't, you know, he's at home now, but he wasn't home. What is me stories? And I have a 17-year-old daughter that I could use the same way, but she'll kill me in my sleep. So I need to know where to stop that line, right? And what Mark said too about not just geographic regions, but congregations change the way you preach something. In Memphis, I worked with a church that was racially diverse. That demanded a different sort of style in some ways. In Alabama, I don't have that kind of diversity. I have a different kind of diversity, though, with people from very many backgrounds. And that changes the style as well, because I may not get up here and say, we all know the story of Noah, because probably shouldn't do that anyway. But there's a good chance there's people that don't know the story of Noah, right? Or not as well as I think they should. So all of those things come into play as far as your originality. But you do those things not because that's your goal. I think that's the thing that's important. You know, Mark Roberts did not start saying every scripture reference 3 times so that people knew him for that. He did that to make sure people found it in their Bibles because he wanted to read the text with him. And that's how he did that. And that became part of his style. And so, again, it wasn't to start something new. It's just, but it became part of who he is. I think that's the key to this, is just as preachers, be yourself. When I started preaching, by the way, they say I do a little bit now, but I had a different voice when I got in the pulpit, like a markedly different voice. You go back and listen to some of my sermons from like the early 2000s. I had what my wife called the preacher voice thing. And I had to grow out of that because that's not me, right? That's just not who I am. I need to be me. I just think that's where, when I think about originality, and it's not the message. Like, again, is there a more original way to present the message than already been presented? I mean, you can change the stories and stuff, but that's really about presentation at the end of the day. And I think that's where we kind of have to see this, is that presentation and style is where probably originality come into play. But you don't even do those things because you want to be the center of attention. I think that's what Mark hit on that's really important. It's very difficult as preachers not to let yourself become the focus.
Right.
You know,
I would
not
say
to let
this,
yourself be the focus.
If we're going to talk about originality, I would say this. I see a growing problem among preachers in the use of other people's material without attribution. The internet has made it possible for us to listen to brethren all across the country, and I know 5 different guys who've been fired for plagiarism. And I think that's an issue that, at least among preachers, we're just going to need to talk about a little bit more, and especially among young preachers, to help them better understand that there are some things that are acceptable and there are some things that simply are dishonest. Plagiarism is when you represent someone else's work as your own. And most people are very good with the understanding that if Terry Francis writes a book on the garden, which it sounds like he certainly needs to do,
No.
and I rewrap the cover and put The Garden by Mark Roberts, that is stealing and lying and deceitful and plagiarism and reprehensible. But if Terry preaches a sermon on the garden and I preach pretty much that exact sermon and I never mention Terry, then that is also plagiarism and stealing and deceitful and reprehensible. And there are plenty of brethren, I'm thinking particularly of our educators, I'm thinking of high school teachers who run every paper that's handed in through a plagiarism checking website and who go look at Wikipedia and to see if stuff got cut, copied, and pasted. I'm thinking of college professors who will suspend a student out of school for that kind of thing, and the honor code and all of that. I get in the pulpit and I'm preaching this sermon, and then on Monday morning, someone is telling someone about this great sermon that Mark Roberts preached on the garden, and so someone Googles sermon on the garden, and Terry Francis's name comes up, and they click that link, and they're listening to the same sermon, but it's a different guy's voice, and they realize I copied that. I took that from Terry without attribution. There's going to be some upset brethren about that, and they have every right to be upset about that because that's plagiarism. And that's something that and it's so easy to attribute. We just need to flat say, I want to talk with you this morning about the garden, and my friend Terry Francis has done a lot of work in this area, and he really helped my understanding, and I want to share some of his thoughts. I want to share some of my thoughts about what's going on in Genesis chapter 3 this morning. You've attributed then, and that's great, and we need to do that. Some of that, I guess, maybe is just laziness. You get guys on Saturday afternoon, and they're trolling the internet for a sermon, and so they end up copy and pasting somebody else's work. Mark Copeland's executable outlines, I think, certainly has been abused in that kind of fashion, in that kind of way. It's just wrong. It's just wrong. And while we don't want to make ourselves the center of attention, we need to do our own work. We need to do our own work. Terry's sermon fits Terry's audience, as he well said. I need to craft a sermon, even if I'm helped by Terry's material, that will fit my audience and fit my style and will fit the time and the place that I'm in. And I can't just pick somebody else's stuff up and preach it and act like, that's acceptable without proper attribution. So if we're going to talk about originality, I think that's an important note for us to sound in that regard.
Yeah, and I'll throw this out there real quick. I told Hal, I said, I knew Mark would bring this up because we've had this conversation some. I mean, I've got friends, so I just have a blanket agreement. Hey, you can take my stuff. Now, but part of that is there's an expectation, like Mark said. If you take a sermon of mine or if I take a sermon of yours, there needs to be a lot of work to make that mine. And what I mean by that is, hey, look, if you take an old sermon of mine and you say, hey, the other day Peyton did so-and-so, and your son's not named Peyton, that's a clear violation of what we're talking about. If I take a sermon and I may see, hey, these are 3 great main points that Mark made, and I take those 3 points and I may even reword them, but I don't take anything else but those 3 points, and I rewrite that whole sermon around those 3 things. That's not plagiarism. But the problem is what Mark's really alluding to is, and I'm not saying we shouldn't say, hey, Mark Roberts preached this and it made me think of this and go through that. I'm not saying that, and I've done that. The problem is a lot of times what we got guys doing is we got guys just going in and changing the bare minimum, the stories, in order to pull this off as their own work. I'll never forget, I worked under Wilson Adams. He was my mentor, and he was preaching about 2 hours away, and I went over and to hear him preach. And when he got up to preach, he saw me and he mentioned me and he said, I'm glad he's here because the sermon tonight I'm preaching is actually a sermon that he preached that I heard him preach, and it was about Peter walking on the water. Well, the reality is that was a sermon based on a book I read by John Ortberg. It wasn't my original material either. You know, I read a book and here's some things Ortberg said, and you know, motivated you to put that down and talk about walking by faith and talk about those kind of things. But here, my mentor, it was uncomfortable for me, but he gave me credit because that's where, and so it was a learning opportunity for me. Now, I've not always been good at that, except for, I will tell you, I've got friends, again, we just have that standing agreement. But part of that agreement is I'm not getting up and preaching your sermon, really. I'm using the core idea of what you presented, and I'm going to change the verses. I'm going to present that differently because there's different things in my view of how things fit together than the way Mark views how things fits together. And if I get up and just repeat what Mark said, it's not my work. It's not my work at all. My biggest issue with that really is this, and it goes back to a bigger issue, and this is Mark's issue too at the core. Hey, when the Bible says that we have a right to make our living by doing this work, but you have to do the work.
Yep.
You can't go and play video games and fish and hunt and Saturday night print out an outline from somebody's that posted online and get up and preach it like it's yours and act like you worked all week. That's a big issue, and it's becoming a bigger issue. At the end of the day, there's nothing new under the sun. Anything I or Mark say as far as this kind of core idea from the text, that's not going to be new. You can go find that from somebody else, but that doesn't give you a right to steal, is the issue. And I think there's a fine balance in all of that. What the way that ties in here is, and this is where the pride comes in. If I take somebody's sermon and it's really good, I want to act like it's my original sermon.
Absolutely.
I want to take credit for it. I don't want to give credit to somebody else. And it's one of those deals where that's just dishonest. And it shows in your part a problem with pride that you are trying to be original when you're not. And I'll say I've done that before, and I was wrong for that. But I think there is a balance to all of that. And I think that's really what we're talking about. And there's nothing wrong with going, hey, Mark Roberts helped me understand this stuff. I want to share some things with you. There's no reason not to do that.
But I think, again, as we talk about laziness, if every week I'm getting up and saying, Hal Hammond had some great ideas about that, and I want to share some of his ideas. And then the next week, Gary Francis had some great ideas about that. After a while, the brethren are going to think, when are you ever going to have some?
Yeah.
And so if I'm on social media all week, I'm correcting the world on everything. And if I'm constantly posting everything on Facebook, or if I'm playing golf, or if I'm hunting, and I'm not doing the work, then that's the kind of thing that happens. A good friend of mine, he posts his sermon outlines on his website. And Saturday afternoon, a deacon called him and said, hey, we're going to pull the website and do some maintenance and cleaning up and so forth and so on. He's like, great, whatever. And about very shortly thereafter, a number of preachers, 5 or 6 preachers, called him and said, hey,
what's wrong with the website?
Where's your website? I need a sermon for tomorrow. Where's your website? Brother, such ought not so to be.
No.
That's not right. We're not doing our own work. We're not planning our work, as Terry pointed out. We're not thinking for ourselves, and we're representing other people's work as being our own. There's just so many things that are wrong with that. And as we've worked in this podcast today, Terry's done a great job of talking about seeing the connections in the Bible. And what that has made me think about is part of the reason why folks don't see that is because the preachers haven't done the work to help people see that. And we're talking about the wrong things, or we're answering.
Uh-oh. Y'all see me at all?
What you talking about? Oh. Go ahead, Hal.
I'm sorry. You both froze there for a second. I think I have a bad internet connection. Did I cut you off in the middle of a thought?
No, you're good.
You're good.
You're good.
I would add also, by the way, that do the work sounds like a great idea for podcast, and somebody really ought to get on that right away. But it's really about your motivation, isn't it? And I can relate to this as a former and recovering young preacher. The idea of what am I trying to do? Am I trying to look competent so I don't get fired? Am I trying to look exciting and interesting so I'll get a lot of meeting invitations? Or am I trying to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ? If my attitude is to help people find the Lord, I'll use whatever kind of tool is at my disposal. And whether, taking credit for something that I didn't do, why would I do that? That doesn't further the cause. That doesn't help. In fact, it probably hinders a little bit, because if I think that Mark Roberts is worth citing in some sermon that I'm preaching, well, why wouldn't I tell people about Mark Roberts? That means that they can go seek out Mark and find out more about this and check the source a little bit more carefully or whatever. That helps the process. It hinders the process when I make it all about me. It's not just an ego exercise, although that's bad enough. It's also a less effective way of preaching the gospel, and I don't want to do that. There have been any number of Paul Earnhardt sermons, for instance, I've memorized and I preached probably almost not verbatim, but pretty close to it anyway. Paul Earnhardt doesn't really have outlines, and so he didn't, at least in my experience, he doesn't. So preaching just kind of a stream of consciousness through Romans is a little easier than trying to preach an outline. But even so, when we are willing to give credit where credit is due, when we're willing to hold up the hands of people who did the work before we were there, that's a noble thing. And I think that we're participating in a bigger venture that way, not just about making sure that I keep getting a paycheck and I keep being able to feed my family, but that I am part of the body of work. And maybe I'll leave something behind for another generation. Maybe I'll contribute to somebody else's legacy, whatever it happens to be. It's not about me. It's about the Lord. It's about the church. It's about the work.
That's exactly right. And I think brethren, at least in my experience, have appreciated authenticity and transparency and humility, that I don't come up with everything, that I am not the first thinker or original thinker about all things. I think preachers probably in general, I'm saying this to myself as much as anybody, need to learn to say, I don't know, and to learn to say, hey, this other guy wrote this really good book or preached this really great sermon, and that's not a threat to my kingdom or to my preaching, because I don't have a kingdom, and we're all in this together. We're all on the same team, and I'm just really thankful that Paul Earnhardt and Dee Bowman and Terry Francis and Hal Hammonds are on this team. And sometimes we need someone to come up and get a big hit, and I'm glad we've got guys on the team like that who can do it.
Yeah, you bring up Dee Bowman. I've always laughed and told guys, if you go steal a Dee Bowman sermon, everybody's going to know you stole it, because you're going to say a word you didn't know, right?
Or you're going to say something about Morton, Texas.
Yeah,
and
where you've never
like,
been.
You didn't grow up there. What are you talking about?
Right, and I'll say, I think it's interesting because in my Bible class right now, I'm teaching James on Sunday mornings, and I'm using a lot of commentaries, but the main one I've been referencing is, throw a pitch out there, Douglas Moo in the Pillar commentary set. It's really excellent. And yeah, and I find myself largely presenting Moo's material in class, and there is a balance at times. When I quote Moo directly, I give, every time I quote Moo, I give Moo a direct quote kind of credit for that. This is a Moo quote, and I read it verbatim. But, people know that I'm looking at, I think it's Kistemaker and Moo and a couple other things, right? But people know that this Moo work is something they should check out. Why? Because I've told them over and over again, hey, Moo presents this and this kind of stuff, which, by the way, partially is just because Moo's kind of a fun name to say when you're talking about a biblical scholar. But and I think there's some balance to this, by the way. I don't think that what we're saying is you have to give credit. Let's say you have an idea from one of my sermons that you put in a different context. It's not even the same sermon. Maybe it's something you just heard me. I don't expect you to go, well, hey, the garden is seen in the temple, and I heard Terry Francis say that. I don't expect that, because, by the way, I've heard that from other people. I didn't come upon that myself. But when you directly take somebody's stuff or you're quoting them verbatim, there's a sense of fairness in all of this and what's right, and that's what we can't overlook in all of that.
That's
And
entirely true. And I think footnoting and citating in a sermon is a little bit different than footnoting in a term paper or even in a
right,
book, in a written work. It's a little bit different to stop the verbal flow. But again, particularly if the main ideas here and the direction, um, and maybe as we talk about preachers being originals, and not having original takes. And I love what Terry said about that. We need to be really, really careful. Everybody has always seen this verse in this way, and all of a sudden, in my profoundness and geniusness, I have a whole new idea on that. Really, really, let's be careful about that. But
yeah,
I think preachers, lots of times, we are looking for a little bit different way to present water baptism or to talk about instrumental music. And so I hear somebody and they had a really cool way of doing that. I need to be careful. If somebody is going to listen to that sermon and then they're going to listen to my sermon and they're going to say, you got that from that guy, I'd better attribute it to that guy or I'm going to appear dishonest. I think about what Paul says about doing all things, that we want to do all things in the right kind of way and to appear honest in all things that we do. And I just want to be careful about that. And so I appreciate what Terry has said. We just can't be footnoting every line in a Bible class and every line in a sermon. But if Moo has helped me, and that is a fun name to say. His
it
stuff in
is.
Romans, by the way, is really good.
Yep.
He sometimes he's so good he almost has to stop being a Calvinist. It's just wonderful. And so, if somebody's helping me like that, then I need to tell people I was helped like this, and as Terry says, that broadens their horizons so that they can be helped too.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I know Mark and I don't know about you, Hal, but we've spoken at the lectures at FC. When I had to write my manuscript, that is unlike any sermon I've ever written, right? I've got a bibliography, I've got tons of footnotes. That's the expectation in that environment. I don't do that every week. I just don't do that every week. You know, I'm not going to footnote everything. I'm not going to, because the other problem is sometimes I may be drawing back on something I can't even remember where to get the footnote at that time. Just because I referenced something doesn't mean I'm looking at the commentary that gave me that idea, right? It's a different environment completely, and I think that's just something to understand from that standpoint and approach. But when you take somebody's stuff and you regurgitate it, you should at least. And I'll say this: if you use my stuff, I have told some guys sometimes you don't have to footnote me, right? It doesn't bother me. But if somebody were to come up and they go, hey, I've got permission from him, and I think that's the other thing is, if you don't footnote them, it better be because you have permission not to footnote them. It should not be because you're trying to come off as the guy that did this. I think there's something to that as well. And what I mean by that is there's a couple of ways to handle this that make this okay. The one way is not okay is to get up and present this as your original work. And I'll get back to what I said in the beginning. Presentation and style is more of what makes you original. Look, if I take a Mark Roberts sermon, there are things that Mark Roberts does that are Mark Roberts through and through. And you're going to, if anybody knows Mark, you're going to see that. That's why I mentioned the vocabulary with D. Bowman. That's a D. Bowman thing. Right? Now, one of the things I learned from D. Bowman is how to triad, because that's how he uses those big words. And there's a lot of us that learn that from D. And we say things in threes, just like D did. Nobody looks at that and goes, well, you're plagiarizing D. Bowman, because it's not D. Bowman's triads.
Right.
Right? So we learn from each other. That's different from stealing from each other. And I think that's a big key to all of that.
I would say that if you're making a point that you heard somebody else make, that makes you a human being and modest and understanding your limitations as a preacher and your need for other sources. I think if you are preaching a 3-point outline that you have from somebody else, that's somebody you need to give credit to. I think if you are preaching essentially the manuscript that you read from somebody else, it may be time for you to get your real estate license. I think maybe preaching is not for you.
That's well, and look, Hal behind you. I'm in the downstairs basement craft room of my wife, but you're in your office. Look, all those books are back there for a reason. We use those books for references. We get ideas from those books that help us understand things. We use stuff from books like that all the time. I mean,
including Kiss to Maker, by the way. He's right.
Including, yeah, I saw that. And of course, I'm more like Mark now. I've been Mark Roberts influenced. I'm more digital, so I don't have nearly as many books anymore. But the point is, we're influenced by other people's work constantly. I've not had an original thought that wasn't influenced by somebody else in some way, whether it's Wright or Kistemaker or Mark Roberts or Hal Hammons or D. Bowman. I am the product of all of the sources that have gone into me to help me gain understanding. And so we acknowledge that, right? All we're saying is that's a big difference, like you said, between that and taking somebody's manuscript and preaching it like it's your own. There's a tremendous difference in those two things.
You've been listening to the Citizen of Heaven podcast. Thank you for your support. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe through your favorite podcast platform and or on YouTube. Comments, corrections, and suggestions are always welcome. Please feel free to follow me through Facebook, MeWe, Parler, or Instagram, or check out my webpage, www.halhammonds.com. Until next time, be strong and courageous, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammonds, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.